What's going on, U.S. history kids? Mr. Tomei here, coming at you with another video for our first unit. We're going to be talking today about the lead up to the Civil War. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's get started. So we enter the 1800s, and what we talked about in the other video, we talked about how the country was going west, and there was a move to go west, and we talked about some of the things that happened as the United States expanded west. While that's what was happening in the 1800s, at the same time, simultaneously, there were other issues in our country, specifically around the issue of slavery and how our country was going to address and go forward and handle the issue of slavery. So as time went on, the country became increasingly divided, mostly culturally along geographical boundaries, the northerners and the southern states. Northern states were looking to evolve. They were looking to move past slavery. Most of the North was much more industrialized and utilized factories. Slavery to them wasn't a driving force in their economy. Or in the South, the practice of slavery was still being used for agricultural purposes and obviously economic reasons. It was a powerful economic force in the South that the South relied on. People even like Thomas Jefferson, who was one of our presidents, he called slavery a necessary evil. He owned slaves. And many people actually, thought slavery benefited Black people. A lot of people tried to tie in the religious aspect that, we were saving these people from Africa, bringing them to the United States, helping them find God, and so on and so forth. The concept that these people were actually benefiting from slavery, which we obviously know isn't true. There's a series of events that occur over the course of 50 years that really lead up to the Civil War. Each little event really increasing the issue and the tension between the North and the South more. So we're going to look at some of those. First big one is the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So after the Louisiana Purchase, there was a question about if new states, let me move my screen so you guys can read, if new states would be allowed to have slavery or not. Both the South and the North worried about if there was an imbalance in how many slave and free states there were. So they didn't want to have there be one more slave state to free states or vice versa, because then there would be one side that has a little bit more power. The Missouri Compromise ultimately determined that the state of Missouri could come in as a free state, but at the same time, they create a new state known as Maine as a free state. So Missouri was a slave state, Maine, free state. Furthermore, a line was drawn across the U.S. that said that any states north of this line would be allowed to be free states, any states south of this line could be slave states. And that was kind of the concept and the way of thinking for a long time on the issue of slavery. So this picture just kind of goes to show you how it looked. States in red were slave states. States in blue were free states. You also had territories unorganized. Those eventually would become states, so on and so forth, some other treaty lines. This is what the United States map looked like at 1820. Starting to kind of look like things that we know about, at least on the East Coast. In 1831, there was a large rebellion known as Nat Turners Rebellion. A slave named Nat Turner incited an uprising that spread throughout several plantations across southern Virginia, a slave state. Turner and about 70 of his kind of people, his cohorts, killed around 60 white people. And this was kind of obviously a result of the hundreds of years of mistreatment and slavery, and Nat Turner and his kind of followers and his group really were over it, and they wanted kind of their revenge. As a result, Virginia lawmakers reacted to this crisis by rolling back what few civil rights slaves had, and even what few civil rights free Black people had at the time. And education was prohibited, and the right to assemble was severely limited for Black slaves and free Black people in Virginia. Inevitably, Nat Turner and his group were all killed for their uprising, but it sparked a big discussion and concern about slavery. And, a lot of people thought in the South that what Nat Turner did, it's like, oh my God, look, they're going to uprise and get on us. That's why we need to be hard on the Blacks in the South. But then people in the North were like, look, we told you slavery was bad. You're just getting you're kind of getting what you deserve now. We get another kind of compromise, this time in 1850. This one allowed California in, shout out California, to the United States as a free state, did not regulate slavery in the remainder of the southwestern territories gained after the Mexican-American War, meaning they could kind of do with what they want. If they want to be a slave state, they could. It also strengthened this thing called like the Fugitive Slave Act. It compelled a lot of Northerners to seize and return escaped slaves to the South. And while the agreement succeeded in kind of like holding back the hostilities between the North and the South, it did little to address and in some ways even reinforce the structural kind of disparity divide in the United States. Again, just the huge cultural difference between the North and the South. Now we get to Uncle Tom's Cabin. This was written in 1852 by Harriet Beecher Stowe. At the time, it was considered a really groundbreaking book about life for slaves. For many Northerners, it opened their eyes to those who were still uncertain about slavery, whether it was good or bad. Believe it or not, people still were not sure, even back then. Southerners saw it as an attack on their way of life. Again, continuing this cultural divide between the North and the South. Today, Uncle Tom is kind of seen as a problematic character, one who was written through the eyes of someone who's a non-slave, like a white person. And many kind of thought the character was just too obedient and docile to his master, like a yes, sir, yes, ma'am, and like almost like some people would say that like was lucky. The way it's written is like this guy was happy and lucky to be a slave. Today, the term Uncle Tom would be it's used disparagingly towards typically someone of color, who's typically someone who'd be Black, who is, for example, if like a Black person came out and supported or didn't support Black Lives Matter or supported Trump, that term would be used to describe them, like they are an Uncle Tom, or that's how it's a derogatory term that can be used. And it's used oftentimes because it's seen as, oh, you're just being subservient to kind of like the white masters and the overseers, and you're just being Uncle Tom. And that's where that term is used. So if you've ever maybe heard that or see that on social media or something, that's where that term originates from. So that's where it comes from. And it's important, and this was one of the most successful books of the entire 19th century, which is the years from 1800 to 1899. And it's pretty influential, especially at the time. And so it's just important you kind of understand, at least you've heard of that book, and you kind of understand where the term Uncle Tom comes from. Now we get to the event known as Bleeding Kansas. This was a period of time that existed from 1854 to 1859. We're getting pretty close to almost the Civil War at this point. Kansas was set to become a new state. The state government decided to hold a vote over whether Kansas would be a free or a slave state. As a result, thousands of Northerners and Southerners came in to Kansas, and they were looking to tip the scale in their favor each way, trying to get more votes so that Kansas could either be a slave state or a free state. This resulted in a lot of violent clashes as thousands of people moved in and were trying to settle land. And it killed many people over the course of 5 years. It led to a really big rivalry with the state of Missouri because there were border skirmishes between Kansas and Missouri. And so today, like those universities, the University of Kansas, the University of Missouri are hated rivals, and it stems back to this moment. There's a big cultural divide between Kansas and Missouri to this day. There's a rivalry, and it stems kind of from this. Another big point and crisis leading up to the Civil War, and one of the most important and famous Supreme Court cases was Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857. Dred Scott was a Virginia slave who tried to sue for his freedom in court. The case eventually rose to the level of the Supreme Court, the highest court in the United States, right? Where the justices found that as a slave, Dred Scott was a piece of property. And this is important. I'm going to double back to this. That had none of the legal rights or recognition afforded to a human being. Think about that. Understand the Supreme Court, the highest court in our land, whatever the Supreme Court says is law. They are the ultimate determining force in our country. If the Supreme Court said tomorrow, or if they said today, 16-year-olds are allowed to vote, that's what would have to happen. If they said the drinking age had to be 18 years old across the country, that's what would have to happen. So whatever the Supreme Court says is symbolically what our country is saying. And even though you got to remember the North is still free, right? Free states. And the North is like, we want to end slavery, right? Even then, racism is so powerful and so strong, right? That even when a case gets to the Supreme Court, right, for a slave trying to sue for his freedom, the Supreme Court ruled against like a human being, and it was forced to stay in slavery. It's kind of insane. And this was only 170 years ago. It really wasn't that long ago, right? You know, I maybe had great-great-grandparents alive then. Maybe some of you had great-great-grandparents alive. That's not that far back, right? It seems further, but it's really not. It's kind of crazy to think that decision was made. And then finally, the ultimate kind of straw that broke the camel's back. This was the 1860 presidential election. For years leading up to this, there was a growing concern that a civil war was going to happen, that the South was going to dip out. And so that's what the 1860 election was about. It was about, as a country, are we going to elect someone like President Lincoln, who's against slavery, or are we going to vote for someone who was in favor of slavery? In that case, the big Southern candidate was Breckinridge. And so the entire election was ultimately about, slavery. That was the whole focus of the election. President Lincoln won by a pretty large margin. You can actually see the Electoral College map that I have up on the map, and you see that Lincoln wins the majority of the northern free states, whereas Breckinridge, who was kind of the southern candidate, won the southern states. And then you kind of see some of the middle states, the orange and the blue states, vote for other candidates. That's because they were really divided. Those states are known as border states at the time because they were kind of considered the border of northern and southern. So they're culturally, they were pretty mixed. There were a lot of people who lived there that were for slavery and a lot of people who were against it. So that's why they didn't really vote for Lincoln or Breckinridge. They kind of found other candidates. But as a result of this election, with Lincoln winning, the South feared that their way of life was going to end. So out of their fear, out of their bigotry, they chose to secede and formally become traitors to the United States and form their own country, or they tried to form their own country known as the Confederate States of America. We're going to talk about them and refer to them as the Confederacy in the next lecture. The remaining northern states were called the Union. And this is what sets up the impending Civil War. And so, some people like to draw parallels to, could this happen? Like kids always ask me all the time, or students like, hey, Tomei, in this year's election, could that happen? I think it's different. I think our country is much different than what it was 160-ish years ago, 150 years ago. But some of the same sentiments are real in terms of the cultural divide between how people think. This one was much more north and south, whereas today, kind of the country we're living in is like, are you Democrat or left leaning, or are you Republican or conservative? And there seems to not really be a middle ground anymore. And so that's why our country has a lot of issues going on right now. So some people, talk, are we headed that way? Could it happen? I don't think so. So I don't want you to worry or be afraid of those things happening. It's more of, it would be a cultural or a mental kind of civil war about where do you stand. But we shall see what happens. So with that being said, this is a pretty short video. This one's just talking about the lead up to the Civil War. We're going to talk more specifically about what happens in the Civil War in our next video. So I will go ahead and stop this share. And you guys have, dab on them, a great day.